Hello you gorgeous people out there and welcome back to another video on the Rocket Shop. My name is Philip and today I'm going to talk about when we can expect Starship's first orbital flight because I have some thoughts about it and I want to share it with you. So, let's go! The first orbital flight of Starship, the day on which the single greatest flying object mankind has ever created takes off into the skies, is a day we can look forward to with a lot of excitement. But as of the current state of development down there in the Boca Chica test site, it doesn't look like we are too close to a first orbital launch attempt. But according to Elon Musk, we are just under a year away. He says that Starship will go orbital somewhere in 2021, so there are only 10 months left to achieve an orbital flight. That means SpaceX has to accomplish a lot to make it possible in this time frame because we aren't that close to it yet. So, which milestones does SpaceX have to achieve to get there, and what do we already have? These are the questions I want to answer in this video. At the moment, we are lacking three crucial things for a Starship orbital flight. We need a super heavy booster, an orbital version of Starship, and an orbital launch mount. Those three things have to be accomplished until we can send it into orbit. But are we really lacking those things, or do they already exist? Well, let's take a closer look. Let's start with the orbital launch mount, because that's clearly the easiest one. SpaceX has been building an orbital launch facility over the past year and has ramped up the work on it in the last weeks. As we can see on the recent footage of Mary, made for NASA spaceflight, the orbital launch site is expanding quite a bit at the moment. There being new parts, new foundations, and new buildings added to the launch site. We have a new tank farm down there, we have what looks like the foundation of a stacking crane, and the launch table the rocket is sitting on during liftoff is being assembled at the production site. So the building of the orbital launch mount shouldn't take too long from now on, just maybe 2 or 3 months and it is completed. But a launch mount is useless if you don't have a rocket to launch from it. So what about the Starship production? Do we already have a Starship that is capable of going to orbit? At the moment there are 6 different Starships being tested or built down there in a test site in Boca Chica. But to determine if one of them is going to be the first orbital Starship, we have to search for some features on the Starship that could indicate us if it is going to be an orbital prototype or not. And I think the most obvious feature that we could look for is the capability of holding a full heat shield, because otherwise you won't get back from orbit, and that is what SpaceX wants to do with Starship. So we need to look for a Starship that can hold a complete assembled heat shield. SpaceX is always building multiple Starships very similar to each other in some kind of series or block version. The 6 Starships we can currently spot in Boca Chica belong to 2 different block versions. The first one being the SN8 series or Block 2 with SN10 and SN11. Those 2 are based on the serial number 8 Starships and are just there to test the landing maneuver. Until now it wasn't that successful, but we hope SN10 can stick it, and SN11 is there in case SN10 fails or to do simply another repeat of the test flight profile to ensure the landing is working. The other 4 Starships, SN15, 16, 17 and 18, belong to another block version called the Block 3 upgrade or the SN15 series. SN15 is basically the prototype of this series, and the other 3 are almost identical to it. The prototypes belonging to the SN15 series or the Block 3 upgrades of Starship have received major upgrades compared to SN8 series or Block 2. One of those upgrades is a new nose cone design. It consists of less parts than the old design and therefore looks a lot smoother and has a lot less weld lines. It's probably better than the old nose cone design we had until now. For an orbital flight, Starship needs a full heat shield. So what we can do is check in if some of those 4 Starships of the Block 3 variant is able to hold a full heat shield. And we can check this if we look for those small attachment pins mounted on the belly of Starship, because those are the pins the heat shield tiles are being attached to. And if a Starship's belly is completely covered in those pins, it means it can be covered in heat shield tiles, which is what we need for an orbital flight. So I've pulled up some screenshots from footage of the new Starships, and what you can see here is serial number 16 aft skirt. And this thing is full of those attachment pins. As you can see, there are multiple lines covering the whole belly of the Starship and this portion of it, which allows a heat shield to be attached to it. The problem is, on this section, also belonging to serial number 16, the attachment pins seem to have been there, but then later on removed from the Starship again, which means there could be the intention that SpaceX wanted to build serial number 16 for an orbital flight, but somehow changed their mind. Because what you can clearly see is there are really marks or like scars on the Starship where the attachment pins should have been, but now they have been removed from the hull. And for the two sections of SN17 that I could find, neither of them has attachment pins for heat shield tiles, which means SN17 will definitely not go to orbit. Unfortunately, we can't tell the status of the heat shield on SN18 because we haven't seen that much part of the hull yet to look for any attachment pins, but considering it is part of the Block 3 iteration of Starship, it should be very similar to SN15 to 17, and due to the fact that they don't have a heat shield, I assume that SN18 won't have one as well. And those four prototypes are only there for doing suborbital test flights, like we have seen it on the SN8 iteration or the Block 2 variant. What I believe is that SpaceX is going to introduce a Block 4 variant for their orbital flights, starting likely with serial number 20 because they have skipped SN12 to 14, so why should they not skip SN19 and start with SN20 to mark a new era, like cleaner number? That's what I would do. But that ultimately means that the Starship designated to go to orbit as first of its kind doesn't even exist yet. And considering the amount of time needed to build a Starship, SpaceX has to start it soon, or they won't get it finished until the end of this year. Assuming that SpaceX doesn't ramp up the speed of their test campaign, a flight of a Starship should occur once every month. And that means that we have 6 Starship prototypes flying in 6 months. That means the first slot for testing a SN20 Block 4 variant of Starship would be in over half a year, so around July, August, something like that. But if SpaceX wants to test the orbital version of Starship already in August, they need to fix another problem they have really fast. It is the Super Heavy booster. Because we don't have any boosters yet. Technically, we do, but BN1 and BN2 both are incomplete. BN1 is mostly there but not stacked together, and BN2, I think we have spotted like 2 parts of it yet, so we haven't got a booster to fly with. Although the thrust dome of BN2 has enough Raptor slots for holding the 28 engines that are needed for a Starship launch, I don't really believe that BN2 will already be the booster for an orbital flight because you don't send your second prototype to orbit technically. I mean, could be around the 15th or 16th Starship build that flies to orbit and the second booster. That would be a little bit fast. And what if BN1 fails? Then they need another booster to test in suborbital conditions in a maybe 150-meter hop or so to fix the problem, which means they would need a lot more time. So I guess that maybe BN3 or 4 are going to be the orbital boosters, and we haven't spotted anything of those numbers yet. Another problem SpaceX has to encounter is, well, they don't have enough Raptor engines yet to launch a Starship into orbit, because you need 28 engines on the booster, 3 engines on the Starship, and 3 vacuum Raptor engines on the Starship to get it to orbit. The problem here is we have only seen a single Raptor vacuum engine yet, and 28 for the booster? That's more than half of the engines that have ever been produced until now. So SpaceX has to really ramp up the production of the Raptor engine to get into orbit, or they have to stop testing Starships and just bunker the engines until they have enough, but I don't think that is the way they're going. So we have to keep an eye on Raptor engine production before we can get to a conclusion. Because we are at the end of this video, I will try to draw my own conclusion now. When do I think will Starship go orbital? Well, Elon Musk has just stated days ago on a Joe Rogan podcast episode that he believes it will be this year, 2021. Well, Elon's timelines haven't been that correct in the past. I mean, he was like 5 years off with Falcon Heavy's maiden flight, but okay. But this time I think it is possible. If SpaceX fixes all the issues they have at the moment with the Starship landing, and if they are fast enough to produce enough Raptors, boosters, and Starship for an orbital flight, they might get it done until the end of this year. I mean, the earliest thing I could imagine would be October, but I think more realistically it's November or December or early 2022. So I think that we will see a orbital flight of Starship in under a year from now on. My prediction is we will see Starship lift off in December 2021. So I hope that was correct. We will see in around a year. And that is it for this video on the Rocket Hub. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you did so, please consider liking the video or becoming one of my first subscribers now, because my channel is still very small. It would help me a lot and would motivate me to do another video. So, we see us next week. Cheers.